The Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today we're talking about screening deals, specifically buyer-seller fit. Welcome, business buyers. What is our goal with this video? Buyer-seller fit. It's to answer the question, will this seller accept my seller note? In the first video on screening, we talked about screening deals three different ways. We talked about screening the transaction, screening the seller, and screening the business. In terms of transaction, that was LBO deal fit. Is this deal closable as an LBO? We've already done that video. Now we're taking a look at the seller, specifically buyer-seller fit. Will this seller accept my seller note? We want to avoid wasting time on deals that are unlikely to close. We need to understand what a seller is looking for. So we created a buyer-seller fit checklist that's specific to a seller, different result. We're going to use the Likert scale again, just like the last video. Let's get started. To buy a business using a max leverage LBO, the seller has to lend you a large amount of money in the form of a seller note or vendor financing. And assessing the likelihood of that happening for a specific deal with a specific seller is the whole point of this video. We need to get the seller acceptance of the seller note firmly in place on your mental radar. It's something we need to pay attention to, we need to assess, and that's what this checklist is all about. Now, what makes a bank lender comfortable lending you money? They'll look at your credit score. They're interested in your business plan, your operating credibility. They will assess your character to repay. Well, you know what? Sellers have very similar comfort needs the same way bank lenders do. What is a good buyer-seller fit? It's really things that make sellers comfortable lending you money or comfortable accepting your seller note. You are setting up a long-term future relationship with the seller. It's based on things like agreeing on earn-out calculations, paying deferred payments on time, complying with deal covenants, protecting the legacy of the business. Let's be honest, the seller is sizing you up. How appealing will your seller note be to this seller? What can you offer the seller? Let me give you an example. I once coached an individual, Liam, a very memorable guy. He was an Irish national living in Dublin. He was an IT network specialist, had no money to invest, which was not an issue. I work with all kinds of people that don't have a ton of money to invest in their deals. He showed me a target company. It was an Oklahoma oil and gas company based in South Oklahoma, specializing in testing equipment, had revenue of $15 million, EBITDA of $3 million, nice little business, ask price was $14 million. He wanted to make a move and put an offer in on this company. I asked Liam, have you worked in this industry before? The answer was no. Do you understand industry opportunities and threats? Another no. Can you add value to the target? Another no. And when I said to Liam, I think this is likely a waste of time and effort, he got a little bit offended. He gave me an answer I have heard before. Why does buyer-seller fit even matter? I won't be managing this business. Well, Liam, because an Oklahoma oil man who spent an entire lifetime building a lucrative oil testing business won't lend an offshore Irish network specialist with no industry experience $10 million in the form of a seller note or vendor financing to buy his business. The buyer-seller fit, Liam, in this deal is missing in action. I told him, you lack industry credibility. You hold little appeal as a buyer. The seller is unlikely to accept your seller note. Now, Liam was smart and energetic, and he 100% could have bought a business. Many people like him have. Liam never did buy a business. But the issue wasn't buying a business. He had the capability to do that. The issue was he was investing time and effort in all these businesses that he had virtually no chance of ever buying. And we just couldn't get that through to him. Liam's problem was not weak deal screening. Liam's problem was no deal screening. And so that's a big takeaway from this presentation. Screen your deals. Let's drill down on buyer-seller fit. What is on the seller wish list? What are they looking for in a buyer? What do sellers want to see before accepting your seller note? This is my list. Others have different lists. First, confident dealmaker skills. Let's look at that. Do you have the dealmaker skills needed to complete this deal? There's a lot to it. Can you make a credible offer? Find the money. Create an LOI. Can you find someone to run the business? Can you supervise drafting the buy-sell agreement? Can you close the deal? In other words, there's lots of people out there who talk the talk. They want to make sure that you can walk the walk before they invest time in you. And that's one of the major goals of the Do-It-Yourself Guide, is to help you build confidence in your deal-making skill. Every item we need screening evidence. We collect evidence to score this item. You clearly set expectations for the seller. That's all great. You've confidently used the right terms and language. And overall, there's been strong communications on what's involved in the buying process. So all in all, I'm giving this one a 4. I think it's being taken care of nicely. Next, confidence in financing ability. Let's take a look at financing. The seller is definitely wondering on the financing side, do you have equity lined up? Do you have bank debt lined up? Do you have an SBA financing arrangement that you're trying to put in place? I mean, your ability to raise money is definitely critical. Even if your financing plan is 100% seller note, you still need to convey comfort on the financing side of things because being able to access capital is such an important and critical success skill for any business owners, and the seller knows that. In terms of screening evidence, I mean, have you mentioned financing frequently? Maybe reference lenders by name if that's appropriate. Mention previous borrowing experience. Whatever it happens to be, make an assessment. Let's assume in this case, there's some good and there's some bad, so we're going with neutral. Next, the buyer has operating capabilities. That definitely matters. A seller wants a buyer with operating capabilities. That's true regardless of whether you plan to be hands-off or not, because a new owner has to direct the business. And so demonstrating capability in this area is important. I mean, if you think about it, buyer operating capabilities are what underwrite the seller note and ensure the seller gets paid. I mean, a seller wants a buyer with operating capabilities. It's not necessary to have identical experience, but the target co should be within your circle of competence. If we take a look at the evidence, do you have any direct experience in this industry? Is target co within your circle of competence? In terms of experience, do you have it, even if it's in an unrelated industry? Size that up. Let's say that when you did in this case, you found it a little bit lacking, and so honesty prevails, you score it a 2. Next, the buyer has the character to pay. I mean, character often remains unspoken, but character is definitely top of mind for any seller when it comes to negotiating a seller note. Will you repay the seller note no matter what? The seller's heard horror stories. I mean, their default position is no. I mean, all unknown potential buyers start out with a character issue for the average seller. I mean, you're assumed to be a bad risk until you can prove otherwise. And so any concrete evidence that you can supply that supports your good character, very, very helpful. In terms of screening evidence, what are sellers looking at? I mean, online presence, what does that look like? Professional reputation, your public standing, whatever it happens to be. And when you make the assessment here, you're feeling pretty good about your ability to convey character, and you're scoring it a 4. Next, the buyer is easy to work with. This is all about rapport. When we're negotiating a seller note, it requires rapport. I mean, a seller has to know, like, and trust the buyer to negotiate a seller note. And without rapport, I mean, a seller note just doesn't get done. So rapport building should be a priority. Are you easy to get along with? The seller's signing on for a 4 or 5 year relationship. And so the seller is wondering, are you future trouble? In terms of the evidence, what's the quality of the interactions? Do you have shared interests and affiliations? Are issues easily resolved? What is the dynamic in terms of rapport? And if you honestly assess it, right, you're going to score it on your checklist accordingly, and you're feeling really good about this one. So it's getting marked down as a 5, strongly agree. Next, the buyer can provide value add to the business. This one's interesting. I mean, sellers understand their absence is going to impact the performance of the business going forward. But can you offset that with new opportunities? Will you bring new people into the mix? Can you open new doors for the business? Do you bring fresh opportunities? If all those things are true, it's definitely going to help you negotiate that seller note. So you have to ask yourself, do you open the door to new people? Do you offer new affiliations? Do you bring fresh opportunities? And when you honestly assess that, you're feeling pretty good about that one too. That one also gets marked a 5. Next, the seller trusts you with legacy. We talked about legacy being important in the last video. This time we're asking whether you can be trusted to protect that legacy. Are you a safe pair of hands? Will you do the seller proud? This is really critical. The problem you face, of course, is that talk is cheap and empty promise is pretty common. If legacy is important, you have to be proactive and weave it into all of your interactions with the seller. In terms of the evidence, I mean, have you clarified what the legacy priorities are? Because legacy means different things to different people. Have you mentioned legacy issues when you're planning? Have you given the seller concrete assurances on the legacy issues that matter to him or her? And when you take a look at that particular issue, in this case, the answer is a strong yes. You feel really good about that. You're marking that one a 5 as well. Next, the buyer has a record of achievement. This is important. I mean, a seller cares about the buyer's record. Whatever achievements you have should be highlighted. Diplomatically showcase your accomplishments. Let your light shine. In terms of the evidence, have you mentioned tangible achievements? Are they relevant to the target co in any way? Have you impressed the seller? That's what this is really about, is that you have the kind of resume where a seller thinks, wow, this is an excellent individual to take over my business. Let's assume maybe you've got it in this case, but you haven't done that good a job of conveying it, or for whatever other reason, you're marking this one a 2 because it definitely needs some work. Next, the buyer has a visible public profile. What's this one all about? Well, the seller wants to be able to find you online. Information IDing you as a buyer is even better. I mean, for one thing, the seller wants to share your information with other people they're talking about when it comes to selling the business. Many people have a business buyer website. Doesn't always work if you're currently employed. The point is the seller wants some kind of third-party verification on you and your business buying story. If they can't find you, that's a bit of a red flag. So do you have a website focused on business buying? Do you have a public blog, a podcast, or something like it? Are you publicly linked to charitable causes? Do you have some kind of public profile where the seller can check you out and check your bona fides? In this case, the answer is yeah, you're out there in public. Sellers can have no problem getting the confidence they need that you are who you say you are. Next, the buyer has a relevant personal referral. Referrals are important. It comes last because it's sometimes hard to get. It's a big old world out there. But a personal referral from someone known to the seller, that's high value. And it's definitely worth exploring the potential. Even a second level connection might help. I mean, a seller wants a known quantity buyer. Certainty carries value. So if you can have introductions or connections from trusted sources, they definitely matter. I mean, do you have a first order connection? Maybe a mutual friend, anyone that's known to the seller that can vouch for you. Even a second order connection helps, where it's not so much that you have common friends, but you have friends of friends. It's definitely something that's worth some time trying to figure out whether you have that connection. And of course, we have tools now through LinkedIn and other things that make it really easy to do. In this case, it's true. You do have some good connections to the seller, so you're scoring this one a 5. Now we've scored all 10 items, and we look at them together. This is Target Co A. We looked at dealmaker skills and the ability to convey confidence and financing ability, our operating capabilities. We looked at the character issue and the rapport issue. Can you provide value added to the buyer? Are you a safe pair of hands where the seller is going to trust you with legacy? Do you have some kind of record of achievement that you can showcase? Do you have a visible public profile that confirms you are who you say you are? Right? Is there some kind of a personal referral you have with the seller? Fantastic if you can. Now, it's hard to assess these. Last time when we took a look at LBO Deal Fit was a little bit easier. It's a little bit more objective. This one is all subjective. It's the seller perception is what matters. It's not so much what you think about these checklist items. It's about what the seller thinks. It's the seller perception that matters. And so when we're scoring this, we're not scoring it according to how we feel about these issues. We're scoring it according to what we think the seller's perception might be when it comes to all 10 of these issues. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to go through them all, of course, because we did this together, but this is the way it's scored out. There's some definitely strong parts in this deal. This one's 39. There's 10 items, so the buy-sell fit is 3.9, which is fairly strong. But again, we don't use buyer-seller fit score to predict success, exactly the same as last time. This instrument is not precise. Each one of these factors doesn't really have equal weight. So what do we use it for? It's a better fit for prioritizing time and effort, trying to figure out, should we spend time on a specific deal? Are we in a position where we can negotiate a seller note with this particular seller? That's what we're trying to figure out. When it comes to buyer-seller fit, the checklist is only one part of the equation. The seller's initial mindset also matters. The seller's willingness to accept a seller note, even before you talk to them, also plays a big role. We also want to take into consideration the seller's initial mindset when it comes to accepting a seller note. If we use a little gauge, we have no, yes, and then neutral in the middle, representing the seller's willingness to hold a seller note, the starting point is kind of important. We sort of imagine sellers to be neutral. Then we think, well, you know what, if we do well on the checklist and we really gear our presentation towards meeting the perceived needs of a seller when it comes to seller note, we can kind of move the needle here into the yes position, improve our chances of buying a business. And I think that's probably faulty thinking. I think a lot of sellers are much closer to a hard no than they are to neutral. This more represents the starting position of most sellers that I deal with. Yeah, they're really quite reluctant to negotiate a seller note at the very beginning. Now, that does tend to change over time. But the openness of the seller to hold a seller note is really crucial, because some think rapport alone can swing the needle from one side to the other. If we have somebody who's, close to a hard no on seller note, and, we put the charm initiative on them, the full court press, work really hard at rapport, we can kind of move them over here. Might be possible in some cases, but I think in general, it's a bit unrealistic to expect that much of a movement from the average seller. Meaning, I think it's important for us to take a look at what the seller's initial openness to a seller note really is. If they're a hard case, they're a hard no, and Dynamite can't move them off that position, that could be a waste of time and effort. So we're trying to get people who are at least neutral to the idea of a seller note, right? And then a strong checklist can really help. If we really are dialed in when it comes to meeting the seller's perceived needs associated with a seller note, and we have a strong checklist, and we have someone who's at least open to the idea of a seller note, that strong checklist can then help us move the needle into a strong position, a yes position. So I would say buyer-seller fit. The seller's initial openness to a seller note is important, and you combine that with a strong checklist, meeting the perceived needs of a seller when it comes to accepting a seller note. That's what's going to put you in a great position to get the seller to accept your seller note. Now, one final thought before we finish up this video. What is the big takeaway from this video? It's not so much perfecting deal screening when it comes to buyer-seller fit. It's just doing deal screening. It's just putting buyer-seller fit on your radar. Don't skip deal screening. We do need an answer to the question, will this seller accept my seller note? Don't just assume it's a yes and then make huge investments of time and effort in this deal. Do a little bit of checking, all right? It can really come in handy. So let's get after it. This is a do-it-yourself guide to business buying. Today we've been talking about screening deals, specifically buyer-seller fit. Always remembering we want to learn and grow as we go. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.